working around the world to prevent and reduce conflict and build peace. I'm so pleased to have you here today. This is the third in our series focused on countering and preventing violent extremism with an eye towards the repatriation challenges. Back in June, we kicked off this series with a partial film screening and a dynamic panel discussion. The event was entitled The Repatriation Imperative: Why Returning Foreign Terrorist Fighters and Family Members Matters, to explore the complexities surrounding foreign fighter repatriation and identify recommendations for the international community. On July 20th, we held our second event. It was called A Bird's Eye View: Inside Violent Extremism, Disengagement, and Reconciliation Programs. Our speakers explored successes and challenges to disengaging former violent extremists and the ways in which holistic reconciliation programs can provide former combatants with opportunities away from the battlefield, reduce violence, address stigmatization, and promote social cohesion. Today, we are delighted to welcome you to our third event in the series focused on reducing and tackling the effects of violent extremism, entitled The Repatriation Initiative: Best Practices for Interventions with Foreign Fighter Returnees and Violent Extremist Offenders. Just days after we mark the 20th anniversary of 9/11, I think this conversation is more important than ever because we have more extremists than ever. So this is going to be an ongoing dialogue to think through the best ways to which we can take them off the battlefield and promote stability around the world. We have a fantastic panel here again. I'm going to now turn it over to Leanne Erdberg-Stedman, the Director of Countering Violent Extremism with the United States Institute of Peace, who will be moderating this discussion. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Megan, and thanks so much to the Alliance for Peacebuilding for holding this entire series. As Megan mentioned, each one has been a dynamic look at this challenge, and if you haven't had a chance to tune into any of them, they're all still available, and particularly the first one with the clips from the film Life After ISIS, I would highly recommend, and then the second one with those real practitioner-based and expertise from Nigeria and from Indonesia and elsewhere. So thank you so much to AFP. And I'm just delighted to be having the third part of this conversation. As Megan said, I can't think of a more poignant and reflective time that we find ourselves in. And I'm really grateful to be part of the peacebuilding community as we confront these difficult circumstances. So our third event in the series is focused on reducing and tackling the effects of violent extremism. And we've had a tour of the horizon, a brainchild of one of our panelists today, Jesse, in conjunction with me and Liz Hume from the Alliance for Peacebuilding. We had charted out to have 3 separate conversations in order to have different touch points of how difficult, challenging, but also doable it is to do the type of work for people who are leaving violent extremism. And we're hoping through these virtual conversations to continue to define the many different ways that peacebuilding and development and a variety of different practices from public health to psychology to neuroscience can help address the complex issues surrounding those who have participated in violent extremism. And through disengagement or reconciliation or a variety of related type of efforts, we can help reduce violent extremism globally. As Megan said, there's more people in more places committing acts of violence in the name of violent extremism than there has been in 20 years. And so with that, we cannot just think of preventing new people from joining, but we have to think about how to equip those who have currently participated with a way out. So at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where I have the pleasure of working, we've been working with a lot of the people who are on the call today and who have been on the various conversations to bring more attention and more solutions to what we've called violent extremist disengagement and reconciliation. And it's led by my colleague, Chris Bosley, who many of you may know, and who is on our second panel discussion on this. And we're trying to bring more peace building and more of a human face to how people leave violence behind. We've been working on a framework that recognizes the needs to identify and lower barriers to disengagement across individual levels, across social levels, and across structural dimensions. As I describe it to lay people, as how do we grease the skids to enable more people to leave? And so on the individual barriers type, we must address cognitive ways in which people have barriers to disengaging. And for the social aspects of this, we have to reduce stigma and promote a sense of justice and try to open more pro-social spaces. And then on the structural barriers, we have to link disengagement with efforts to address legitimate grievances, the underlying political and systemic tensions, and help build more resilient communities. So we're discovering a variety of things with our Vader initiative, and I hope that this, framing at the top really helps set up our really distinguished panelists today to be able to talk about their practice, the work that they have seen, and how we can all work together to empower people and a variety of different communities across the world to build more sustainable peace in their homes. So please stay tuned over the next year to the Institute of Peace as we're planning on releasing an action guide on this topic, which we're diligently working on, including having one of our panelists today as one of the key advisors and writer of the guide, Mike Nikonchuk. But enough about the frameworks and our work. I think it's time for us to hear from the experts about what they are doing and how they are working with people who are leaving violent extremists behind. So we have, as I mentioned, we have a very distinguished panel today. I know you are all eager to hear from. I will serve as the moderator throughout this conversation. Each panelist will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes or so. I'll moderate a short conversation amongst the panel with a Q&A from the audience. So please put questions into the Q&A function or into the chat function, and we'll make sure to be asking those to our panelists throughout the conversation. So first, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Heidi Ellis, a longtime practitioner and scholar. She's the director of the Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center, an associate professor of psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and a longtime champion, and helps all of us learn more about this field. So Heidi, over to you. Thanks for kicking us off.
All right, Leanne, thank you so much for the introduction and the opportunity to be here. And thanks to all of you who are putting up with another Zoom hour in order to have this conversation about what I think is a really important topic. So, as Leanne said, I'm a clinical child psychologist at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. And over the past few years, I've had the opportunity to work with practitioners from several countries who are actively repatriating families, including Kazakhstan, Kosovo, and North Macedonia. Prior to that, and continuing still, for many years, I worked in the field of refugee family mental health. And what I want to talk about today is the way in which lessons taken from work with refugee families might be applicable to and informative to our thinking about how best to support this population. Early in the field of refugee mental health, there tended to be a somewhat myopic focus on trauma as a critical issue. And logically, the necessary response was then individually focused trauma treatment. What we've come to realize as a field is that while trauma is a really important part of both experience and treatment for many refugee kids, it is not the whole of it and needs to be situated within a broader effort to address stressors in the social ecology. In refugee mental health research, we've identified 4 core areas of stressors and strengths that impact mental health and adjustment. Trauma is one of them, but also acculturative stress, or the tension of holding a set of beliefs or practices that conflict with the dominant culture you are living in. Another one is resettlement stress, which refers to the basic challenges of finding employment, housing, healthcare, etc. And then finally, and very importantly, isolation, which includes social disconnection, but also experiences of stigma or discrimination. So across all of these, there are also mitigating strengths, such as strong family bonds or access to supportive services. And what we've seen is that if you address all of these stressors and strengths in an integrated manner, you leverage healing in a much more powerful way than if you address these areas in isolation. So my point number 1, and I'm going to do 3 points because when I'm listening to someone on Zoom, I glaze over if it's not like super clear to me what they're saying. So point number 1, working with families who are repatriating should take a socio-ecological approach and consider trauma, but also acculturative stress, resettlement stress, and stigma and isolation. Over the past 20 years or so, we've developed a specific treatment model for work with refugees that takes into account all of these stressors and strengths and the way that they work together. This model, which is called trauma systems therapy, takes a multidisciplinary team approach. No single discipline or provider can cover the range of services needed, but just as important as making sure that the range of services is provided is making sure that those services are integrated. Having a lot of services that operate separately in silos can actually be counterproductive. But making sure they are integrated and that the providers communicate effectively about their shared goals and efforts can pull them together into a very powerful treatment approach. The idea of multidisciplinary teams as central vehicles for both supporting successful repatriation and also more broadly preventing radicalization to violence has started to gain traction in the field. And that work is very consistent with where a lot of mental health treatment models are headed. In work with repatriating families, these teams can include psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists, and educators, but also cultural, religious, or ideological experts that can help providers understand some of the beliefs and practices of families and also be a trusted liaison to families. North Macedonia is a country that I would hold up as an example of a place where they really embrace this idea of multidisciplinary teams. So my point number 2 is that I think multidisciplinary teams are critical to best practices in repatriation. And the last point I want to make is around culture and engagement. Whenever you draw on Western models of care and try to transport them into different settings, you run the risk of having them be irrelevant at best or damaging at worst. In my work with refugee families, I early on discovered that the trauma treatment models that I learned in grad school were useless in working with refugee families because, quite simply, those families didn't see what I was doing as relevant to the problems they were having. And it wasn't until I started partnering closely with members of refugee communities, integrating them into the treatment team as equal partners, learning from them about cultural and family values, that we began to see how we could frame and adapt our work to address what families cared about. And when we did this, suddenly families were interested in working with us. In my work with providers who were working with families who are repatriating from former conflict zones in Syria and Iraq, I think one of the biggest barriers that is talked about is engagement. There's no magic bullet around engaging families, but based on my work with refugee families, I would say this: whatever we do has to integrate an understanding of culture, beliefs, and values, and whenever possible, integrate providers who share some aspects of families' cultures. And I know Jessie has done a lot of thinking and important work around how some of the language and practices of the Islamic faith map onto some components of mental health and trauma treatment. And it's this kind of careful, respectful integration of culture and beliefs into the work that has been critical to our success in working with refugees, and I think will be equally important to consider in working with repatriating families. So my point number 3, we need to understand, respect, and integrate culture and cultural understandings into the work. So the 3 lessons from my refugee work that I think have relevance here are around the importance of the socio-ecological approach, the use of multidisciplinary teams, and integrating and understanding culture. Having said that, though, I also want to acknowledge that as practitioners get deeper into working with families, we may come to understand ways in which this work is also unique, and that not all aspects of what we've done in other contexts are fully transportable. I've been really impressed by the commitment, heart, and insight that providers are bringing to this work in the various countries that I've had the opportunity to, in some way, partner with on this. So moving forward, we have a lot to learn from them, and they from each other. So I look forward to continuing conversations like this one today that allow for collaborative sharing of ideas. And I think if we're able to work together and see this as a collaborative effort to understand how to do something new in the best way possible, we can succeed in doing this. So I'm going to wrap with that and turn it back to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Your 3 points are really well noted. I hope that it becomes resident in all of our vocabulary to be talking about a socio-ecological approach and multidisciplinary teams, and really the third point on understanding and respecting and integrating cultural context, I think, is often mentioned, but not taken enough time to do the hard work of working with families, working with the level of engagement that's necessary. And as you said, kind of being really open-minded to the levels of commitment and heart that other people are bringing into this space that they know. So thank you for all of those insights. I hope we can take many of them into future practice. And thank you for kicking off our conversation with so much good information. So next, it's my pleasure to introduce Mike Nikonchuk. He's the Program Director for Trauma and Violent Conflict at Beyond Conflict. He is a practitioner and an author of the Field Guide for Barefoot Psychology. And it is always my pleasure to be able to share the virtual stage, but also when we were in person with Mike. So Mike, looking forward to hearing from you, and over to you.
Thank you, Leanne. It's always so fun to speak with this group and this crowd. I learn so much every time I hear Sophia, Heidi, Jesse, and folks at AFP and USIP share their insights. So following on what Heidi said, I just want to share a little bit about some of Beyond Conflict's working understanding of how issues of trauma, chronic stress, and adversity, as Heidi mentioned, that come in so many different shapes and forms, might contribute to our theoretical understanding of pathways out of high commitment to violent extremist causes and participation in violent extremist organizations. I have a couple of slides that I will try to not balance between effectiveness and technicality, which is often a delicate balance. But I want to share a little bit of some of Beyond Conflict's working understanding of some of the processes in the brain and body that can contribute to the not only trauma recovery process, but that also bear tremendous relevance on recovery for life after extremism, so to speak. So I think that y'all have let me share slides. Do let me know if that's not possible on this particular Zoom. All right. So I think y'all can see my screen. Give me an amen or some sort of sound. Great, thank you, Leanne. So we know that trauma is relevant for peace building, whether it's acculturation stress, whether it is resettlement stress, as Heidi mentioned, or specific conflict-related trauma, or trauma that comes from an individual participating in violent extremism or pre-participation in their childhood. We've seen studies show how chronic adversity in its many different forms or acute lifetime trauma has all sorts of negative outcomes, or is related to all sorts of negative social behavioral outcomes. So we can see that participation in violent extremism sits alongside a host of other antisocial outcomes like crime, negative attitude towards reconciliation, increased tendencies towards supporting violent activism, thanks to Heidi for that research, alongside issues of intergroup hostility, addiction, recidivism into crime, et cetera, et cetera. So it's hardly, violent extremism as a unique behavioral outcome that we see associated with childhood or adulthood trauma. The changes that happen as a result of trauma can occur at different levels, including at the level of the physical brain, in our bodies, and in our behavior. Give me 1 second, apologies, the technical difficulty here.
I'll do my best to fill the air while Mike deals with his technical
No,
difficulties.
I'm back. Apologies.
Great.
So briefly, I was just saying that the relevant changes that we see in individuals through experiences of chronic stress and trauma manifest at all these different levels, everything from hormone levels in the brain, communication between brain regions, immune and inflammatory markers, cardiovascular health, but some of these also psychological processes that play a deep role also in radicalization journeys, issues of feelings of shame, guilt, hopelessness, heightened sensitivity to discrimination, mistrust in myself, in others, and institutions. So these experiences that are individual are also social in some of their outcomes. So we can see how at various different nested levels, individual experiences of trauma can manifest over time and affect that broader social ecology that Heidi mentioned, slowly with time and lack of treatment, affecting our psychology, behavior, relationships, entire communities, our cultures and systems and narratives that go on then to influence the likelihood or influence trajectories of extremism for whether it's marginalized communities, folks that are coming from particular backgrounds in minority groups, or for even dominant populations that somehow feel that they individually have some compelling cause or significance quest that compels them towards radicalization. So I would just say that overall here, what we see in individuals is that specific trauma or stress-related adaptations lead to barriers to healthy engagement in community, which increases risks of negative outcomes, which then maintains conflict and stressors that can influence trajectories into and out of violence. So in this sense, recovery from trauma or dealing with the effects of stress and trauma in individuals who have gone down that path of extremism is sort of a two birds with one stone approach, because we're looking at tackling some of the lingering effects or the long-term effects of experiences of stress that may have contributed to decisions towards extremism, but also dealing with the process of disengaging, with which itself comes with all sorts of contextual stressors, including the stress of repatriating, of reacculturating, of adjusting into potentially high stigma environments. So we see this trauma-sensitive approach to dealing with those exiting extremism as also potentially addressing some of those early pre-engagement drivers, as you could say. So one of the things that we've done beyond conflict, and I'll just really mention here briefly, is that we've been working in an approach called the Field Guide for Barefoot Psychology, which takes a very psychoeducation heavy approach where we simply teach folks about what trauma, stress, and chronic adversity do to the brain. And by simply teaching those elements, whether it's at the level of the immune system, cardiovascular health, relationships, the way we think about ourselves, so teaching some of the biology and sort of social psychological impacts of chronic adversity and trauma from whatever the cause might be it structural inequity or acute wartime trauma, and providing folks an opportunity to explore culturally sensitive practices that are self-care oriented, that promote emotion regulation. We've noticed a strong reduction in stigma towards mental illness in folks who we've done a randomized control trial of this. And those folks that have a decreased stigma towards mental health are more willing to engage in health promoting behaviors and self-care exercises. And that willingness to engage in any number of culturally sanctioned activities for self-care is what's going to drive improvements in trauma-related symptoms and emotion regulation. So it's not simply about providing treatment, it's about providing treatment plus education that allows folks in their relevant cultural contexts to reduce stigma towards their own experiences of mental health and to find ways forward of engaging in culturally sanctioned and appropriate self-care activities that can drive the change, irrespective of what an individual therapist or practitioner thinks should be the modality of treatment. It's also about encouraging that type of approach to mental health that encourages and that doesn't discourage exploration of different care pathways that are grounded in sensitive practice, be it in the Islamic tradition or other faith traditions. So I'll leave it with that for our current profile of work and some of the theoretical contributions that we're working on now. Back to you, Leanne.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was incredibly educational and I think very dignifying to be thinking about the ways in which you're empowering people through psychoeducation and from a real, a deep sharing of knowledge about what trauma and what a variety of adverse circumstances does to a person. It's not a diagnostic, it's an empowering framework. And so thank you so much for sharing it. All of the neuroscience, the behavioral health, physiological aspects of it are all very welcome components to just really build out how complex it is of a system, and the ways in which you're trying to help ordinary people really understand themselves and understand the circumstances that they find themselves in. So thank you. Thank you for that. A really nice dovetail with what Heidi had said, and we'll continue to dovetail into one another. So next we're going to hear from Jesse Morton. He's the founder and executive director of Parallel Networks. Many of you know him from the previous events in this series, and Jesse devotes his time to preventing people from participating in a path that he once took. So Jesse, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and for everybody that's joining us today. I'll talk a little bit about how I've learned from everybody on this panel, and in the process of doing so have been, I guess, uniquely positioned with an ability to implement some of the learning that is going on in the space. My organization, Parallel Networks, was started 4 years ago in conjunction with the NYPD official at the former director of intelligence at the NYPD that used to monitor me for several years. And what we thought was missing in the realm of CVE or preventing and countering violent extremism, was largely that, we saw a lot of papers, we saw a lot of think tanks, we didn't see any practice. And there was this heavily ivory tower driven empiricism that we needed more evidence before we could implement. But we thought that you learn by tinkering and toying and by getting your hands dirty, that you learn by doing and then you evaluate. So if you don't have a sufficient sample size of people that you've actually intervened with, then it's very hard to develop promising best practices and interventions. So we just set forth in a very sort of hypothetical and experimental way to just throw ourselves out there and see what we could achieve in the space. So our organization now works internationally and domestically, and one of the niche areas of involvement that we've been able to get active in is in the space of foreign terrorist fighter and family member reintegration, rehabilitation, and also in the realm of extremist offender reintegration and rehabilitation. When you develop monitoring and evaluation, I think that one of the things that's oftentimes missed out on is the development of a comprehensive holistic theory of change that can identify assumptions that are informing how you believe the field of practice is going to work. And I think that underlies a lot of what goes on in countering violent extremism, because there's this concept of deradicalization, which basically for the longest time pushed this notion that it was an ideological phenomenon. And then we did transition from that, distinguishing between disengagement and de-radicalization. But the lag time between implementing the advances in the scholarship in regard to changing and altering the landscape of actual practice has always been one that, even when I was a jihadist recruiter, we used to literally laugh at the counter-terrorist experts that could just become our primary means of propagandizing, because they could pick up the chatter that we would send out. They would talk about it. Now they talk about it on Twitter, and then the media picks it up. And it really creates this problem where we are able to react to what the counter extremists are doing because of the lag time between publishing and implementation, and the bureaucracies that are involved with shifting and transitioning into doing something in the field vis-a-vis discussing it, makes it easy to make CVE a totally reactionary space. So long story short, we've developed and thinking through what we've learned, we've now done 250 domestic extremism cases of de-radicalization, if you want to call it that. We've worked with in the foreign terrorist fighter and family member returnee space. We've worked in North Macedonia, in the West Balkans, in the Maldives. We've worked with people in Iraq. We've worked with the women and children in Al-Khol and Al-Roj. Worked with Canadians. We worked with people from the Netherlands. We worked with people from the United Kingdom, the USA, etc. And one of the things that really becomes that you really become aware of when you talk to these individuals is, number one, a lot of the things that are being driven and discussed and what we should do are not going to work, that each case is individualized and it requires a heavy level of expertise along the lines of what Heidi and Mike are talking about. An inculcation of an understanding of the culture, an understanding of the history, and a gender dynamic, which is part of a trauma-informed approach, right, is what we really needed to establish. So we built out comprehensive 75-page long theories of change for each different population in each different localized ambit that we were working with, because your theory of change is really your first basis for monitoring and evaluating your progress. If you can't test things that come about from a multidisciplinary review, then you're not testing arenas of operation like mental health and other intervention mechanisms that might be evidence-based, but that could be tweaked, that could work in the space. And instead, CVE, when we got into it, was looking at rebuilding the wheel. We don't have any evidence, so we have to think, we have to learn, and then we build the intervention. So we started to pull in concepts from trauma-informed care in particular. And as we started to implement them into our intervention protocols, we learned that this is going to open up a whole new avenue. Everybody was talking about trauma, in the peace building field, like around tables and stuff. But when Alliance for Peace Building would ask them for okay, give us examples of where you're actually implementing it, nobody could provide any documentation. So we thought this was a really serious avenue into progressing and moving forward. And so we have now, along the lines of what Heidi suggested, a theory of change that starts with building out an ecosystem of actors, a multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary ecosystem of actors. Because if we're not creating communities of practice that are sharing and learning knowledge from each other, then quite frankly, we're not even doing what extremists do so well, right? And if you can't even match what extremists do so well, then you can't really counter extremists. And that's just one way to sort of put that. A lot of what we have developed off of our theory of change, because one thing to have a theory of change, is another thing to be able to take a component of that theory of change and develop an evaluable instrument that's derived from that theory of change, so you can go back and test your theory of change. And over the past year and a half, 2 years, we received first funding to implement a trauma and countering violence extremism informed approach in the Maldives, where they are developing a national reintegration center that will house people coming home from Al Roj and Al Hawl and return in a confined environment, which creates a very interesting opportunity to test actual interventions. However, if you don't have an ecosystem of actors or a community of practice that has the prerequisite knowledge to develop those tools, then you can't do so. So we've been able to experiment with the types of trainings, the type of educational, psychoeducational instruments along the lines of what Mike is talking about, along the lines of what Heidi is talking about, and to train their practitioners that are going to be working with the individuals. And then we got a DHS grant for domestic extremism, working with extremist offenders that are located in the American prison system. And instead of apply the theory of change to psychoeducational ecosystem of actors development, we built our first intervention workbooks, 10-session workbook. It allows us to look at a problem in extremist offender reintegration is you're in a confined environment. You don't have any communication with the people that you're going to meet after you leave. There's no tailored programming in the US system for de-radicalization. This 10-session workbook allows us to combine narrative therapy. It allows us to combine fiction. It allows us to combine cognitive behavioral therapy and to pull from all of those best practices that we identified in our comprehensive theory of change, and in each session test some of their applicability. So this 10-session workbook also allows us to develop a human connection with individuals that the real risk is when they come back. So we talk about Usman Khan in the UK and how upon his release, he was gaming the system and he turned into a terrorist, but he had said he completed a de-radicalization program. He was feigning the whole time. I would suggest that it's not necessarily the truth. I would suggest stressors, and particularly the neuroscientific stuff that Mike talks about, was largely responsible for reactivating or re-traumatizing this individual. And that's another long story, but I say it to suggest that that development of rapport and the connection to the ability to facilitate better socio-ecological attention and create an environment around which these individuals feel safe when they return is as applicable to extremist offenders in the United States coming home with terrorism-related offenses as it is to someone in the Maldives who might be living in a national reintegration center for 9 months, working and in a confined environment, feel completely stable, balanced, and over their trauma, and then gets thrown out into society, and the very thought of a rickshaw driving by re-triggers the trauma, and all of a sudden they don't have the social support systems in place and they're on their own and they have to deal with it. Thus 9 months of treatment doesn't work. And so our 10-session workbook is now being applied in a reverse type of way. Just yesterday, we received recognition that we will get a different DHS grant to create an ecosystem of actors with Mike's Barefoot guide and our intervention toolbook, training interventionists in the United States and working with the Department of Probation, other sectors, multi-sectoral places. Heidi and Sophia would be trainers, and we'll be able to create that sort of culture around which an ecosystem of actors and multidisciplinary teams can formulate. And that is definitely, Heidi, being done in North Macedonia. I think their plan, although I don't know if the implementation is far along and is actually being utilized. But that's really the idea I think that we have to have. Like, rather than talk, I could count off like 14 different best practices books on like what to do with extremist offenders. They all say the same thing, and it actually means they all say nothing. They give you absolutely no tools that you can use when you actually interact with these people. If I'm talking to Hoda Mufena in a camp in El Roj, she's at a very different state of mind than another woman who's 3/10 down, who's from Canada. It's totally different approach. It requires fluidity, but if there's the structure based into the intervention, then we can start to base our learning on actual evidence-based practices and push to that space. In conclusion, developing those actual interventions and implementing them, we could talk more about it in Q&A about the specific components of it. We will also be implementing an advancement of the tool that we have developed and the tool that Heidi has developed and some ideas that Sophia has. When we enter into this ambit, we will be working in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, where we will continue to develop this. And I think that's the way of moving forward. There is a principle of do no harm, right? There is definitely a principle of do no harm where you want to build out interventions that are evidence-based, but you cannot wait a decade to have the evidence, because one thing, by the time a paper is published in an academic journal or a think tank piece is published, the fluidity of extremism has already changed the circumstances on the ground. You can't apply what you've learned about jihadists to far right-wing extremists, even though we're replicating the same mistakes as we speak. You have to learn by doing. And that means you have to find the qualified individuals that sort of have an intuitive sense. It's like substance abuse counselors that have been there, that have been addicts. And then instead, you have to build them into a multidisciplinary unit, including academics that can study the outputs and the impacts of the work that these individuals are doing. Even if it's only with 5 individuals, we started like, okay, well, we think looking at correlations between adverse childhood experiences and the individuals that we started to work with, we started to do it like 10 cases in. And now we have like 250 cases of intervention with domestic extremists where like the correlations are just stunning. Like if you give them an ACE test, once you establish rapport, you're like, Jesus, this is like phenomenally higher than the rest of the base population. You can't get that if you don't have access to the community. And so I'll end there, and we kick it off to Sophia, who will talk about her expertise and some of the things that she thinks might be included into the interventions that we're developing that might even make them more effective and successful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jesse. That was an incredible tour de force. But I would definitely highlight some of your commentary on the human connection, on the importance of agility and adaptation and what you call tinkering, which I think is a really important space for, particularly in that intersection between policy and practice, to make sure that practice is driving more of the policy changes. Thanks again to you for reiterating this ecosystemic approach as being incredibly important, and for detailing to us what are some of those parts of the intervention toolbook that have to be specifically catered to each individual, and really highlighting the importance not just of context, but of the ways in which we interact with individuals. So as usual, learning so much from you, from everybody on this panel, and it is my pleasure to introduce our last speaker, Sophia Moskalenko, who's a researcher for the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, which many of you know as START. She's a research fellow at Georgia State University, and her clinical perspectives in the application of interventions in the field are really leading the way. So it's our pleasure to have Sophia to bring us home on this panel. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm gonna share slides with you. Again. Sorry, technical difficulties, as they say. Okay. Let's try this. And I don't think I can. All right, never mind the slides. So I'm here to talk about a new approach to countering and preventing radicalization. And so you might want to know, what is wrong with existing approaches? The answer is several things. So as some of the people on this panel have already mentioned, the existing approaches tend to be reactive, countering threats of past attacks as opposed to anticipating radicalization of the future, and so missing out on whole populations, whole social movements. They often are punitive, isolating, persecuting, and stigmatizing individuals, and in so doing creating new grievances and new radicalization. They're rarely informed by theory or data, and so they tend to be haphazard. One intervention would have populations at risk participate in team sports, for example. It's an actual intervention. A different intervention might have them learn about how radicalization is bad for them. That's another actual intervention. And so the result, as you might suspect, is there is very little systematic approach in this, and as a result, very little progress. The interventions of today tend to focus on ideology. There is implicit assumption that if people are radical in their ideas, that they will act on these ideas at some point or are at risk in doing so, even though about 20 years of research in radicalization have demonstrated that assumption to be false. Something like 96 to 98% with radical ideas never do anything with that. And a lot of people who act radically really don't know much about ideology and do so for other reasons. And so on average, everything we know in terms of the effectiveness of existing CV approaches shows by any metric that most of them have either a zero impact on categories that we're interested in impacting, or they actually have a net negative impact. Like I already suggested, producing new grievances, as for example, countering violent extremism among jihadis after 9/11, with the random checks at the airport and the embedded people into mosques, created this widespread perception that the war on terror is actually the war on Islam, which became a rallying cry for radical groups like ISIS and a recruitment tool. In fact, radicalization is a complex phenomenon that consists of risk factors that then occasionally, through radicalizing mechanisms, lead some individuals or group toward radicalization. And so the suggestion is that it would be better to address the risk factors and the radicalizing mechanisms as opposed to the end result of radical action. And so enter this program called MBSR, which stands for Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, that was developed in the 1970s by John Kabat-Zinn. And typically it is an 8-week course during which people meet in groups once a week for about 3 hours. And these courses include a number of elements. So one is people are taught about the physiology of stress and stress reactivity, what it does to the body. They are taught some very easy mindful movement techniques, which can be yoga or Tai Chi or Qigong. They're taught several different kinds of meditation techniques. They learn to hone and strengthen the mind-body connection through breath work and meditation, and they practice moment-to-moment awareness. So since 1970s, MBSR has been validated through a variety of research methods, including brain imaging studies that show measurable, meaningful changes in the brain functioning as a result of MBSR. There are randomized controlled clinical trials that compare the effects of MBSR with pharmacological interventions and other treatment modalities, as well as with placebo. And now we have meta-analyses that put together a lot of different studies of MBSR to show all of these studies that MBSR is very successful in reducing a number of psychopathologies, such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, bipolar disorder, as well as they help with pain management, with chronic diseases and autoimmune diseases like arthritis and diabetes. But more important for us here today, given our shared interest, is that a lot of studies demonstrated that either the full MBSR program or specific elements of the MBSR program are empirically capable to reduce radicalization risk factors or mechanisms. So among these risk factors of mechanisms of radicalization that have been demonstrated to be reduced through MBSR elements are violent recidivism among criminal offenders, aggression in response to provocation, anger, prejudice, cognitive distortions, perception of the world as a dangerous place, and active polarization, all of which in turn have been linked with radical action. And so the idea is to take these helpful elements of MBSR and combine them into a program that would intervene at the stage of radicalization risk factors or radicalization mechanisms, instead of at the stage where people are already acting out. So Jesse and I are developing this program that we call MBPR, Mindfulness-Based Prevention of Radicalization, that would combine select elements of MBSR that were empirically linked to mitigation or prevention of radicalization markers. It would include a highly scripted manual to reduce the likelihood for practitioner error when it's implemented. It would have add-on modules that would be that would make this program translatable across different cultural contexts. So, for example, for individuals that come from the Muslim community, jihadist tradition, we would have each element linked with specific verses of the Quran to make this element more acceptable and to reduce resistance in participants. We would have pre and post program measures of radicalization and relevant things like emotional resilience, distress and response to triggers, and other things. And we would also include a longitudinal assessment sometime after the program had commenced, some weeks or months later, in order to measure the durability of any changes observed, hopefully. And so we would be implementing this first in the Tajikistan population of returnees from the ISIS-held territories, women and children mostly. And hopefully in the next 6 or 9 months, we will have preliminary data to share with you how that fares.
Sophia, thank you so much. And we're really excited for the journey that you have described to us. I mean, I knew how cutting edge it was prior to this conversation, but hearing you kind of explain where this was born out of, I think we are all invested in your success. And part of the last part of your remarks on, really thinking about the durability of changes observed. I think that that's something that has not been very well understood or even well established within those who are trying to work on violent extremism. One of my colleagues often talks about is like, we should never define success if we're just pushing one type of violent behavior into another type of violent behavior. If somebody stops being an extremist but starts being a domestic abuser, for example. And so how do we really think about the durability of changes observed in the ways in which you talked about on the anger, on recidivism, and really having a much more holistic understanding. So thank you so much. These panelists have really blown my mind. I hope they've done the same for everybody else today. We're going to have a little bit of moderated conversation. I thought I would kick it off with some of my questions, but I really like 2 of the ones that have been put into the chat. So I might go straight with some of the audience ones. Please feel free to put more into the Q&A and into the chat, and we'll continue from there. But the first one is from Christian Correa, who said that really wants the panelists to talk about the social dimension of stigma, that addressing the personal factors is essential, but for reintegration, they need a welcoming community. And how do we address the stigma on the side of society at large, particularly given resistance to repatriation, the denial of citizenship in some countries, and the key political context in which people are reintegrating into. So do we have any lessons or any thoughts on that? And I'll just open that one up to any of the panelists who want to jump in, and we'll go from there.
I'd be happy to share some thoughts on that because it's a great question. And as you know, stigma or discrimination is one of the 4 core stressors that I talked about. So in our treatment model, it starts with the individual in that you want to, a kid might be referred to you and you do an assessment of their sort of larger social ecology and what's happening, but very quickly treatment of the individual starts involving thinking about social stressors that are occurring in that wider systemic context. So an example would be, very commonly you might work with a kid and find that they're being triggered in school because there's bullying going on or something in that setting of concern. Well, we don't just sit there and talk to the kid about how to tolerate feelings they have about being bullied. We go and we work with the school system, and we would be then kind of echoing out from the individual case to build a systemic response. And again, drawing from our work with refugees, it often involves, training school educators or working in the school context to think about how a whole culture could be shifted. So that's an example from a different context, but we're seeing the same thing in our work when we are doing training and capacity building in countries like Kazakhstan or Kosovo right now. We've been involving school counselors and working with them around how this isn't just about you working with kids. This is about you working with the school and parents and the larger community. So, and in addition, I'm sure there are other really important ways to address broader community stigma issues. And, there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into the process of how you roll out a program and who you're talking to and the partners you're engaging and the frame that you're providing. That happens, more at this meta level of program development. But I think it's a both and. You can do it through the clinical work and thinking about how that takes you into the systems that a child moves through in the course of their day. And you can also think about it programmatically and how you're putting something together and the partners that you're bringing to the table and the narrative you're using.
And I'll just jump in really quickly because that is a very interesting component that is oftentimes discussed, but most often overlooked and not inculcated. It's really important to think about the culture that you're creating. Let's say you're a government or you're a local community that is trying to create resilience, which is a question I believe that is coming up based upon the VEDR model. And there's not enough effort in understanding how strategic communications in the realm of stigma reduction at the level of self, at the level of society, and structural stigma can be addressed to create a culture and an environment that is conducive to the social connectivity that is required to a person eradicating or addressing their own self-stigma. So if you build in a strategic communications campaign in countries that you are repatriating ahead of time before people start reintegrating and rehabilitating, then you're getting ahead of the curve. And we've seen this in some countries. In particular, I believe that Tajikistan has done a great deal by offering amnesty and documenting the need to treat these people as human beings. They're paving a ground for now when they start repatriation to have less stigma. But at the same time, when they tried to return families, children that were taken from their mothers who are going to do life in prison in Iraq and return them to other family members, like 85% of the families refused to take the children because of the stigma that could go on at a local community level. So it's a hugely enormous problem. And as I said, those things start to set in when you come home. Me, I did 2 years of solitary confinement in the hands of the Bureau of Prison System. And I thought, they left me out during my last year and a half of incarceration, and I was starting to deal with all of this. But walking around and looking at the adverse consequences of that solitary confinement, I started to think that everybody for the first several months of my reintegration, started to think that everybody knew I was a convicted terrorist offender. And I cannot tell you what that did to separate my body and my mind and have to learn how to take those skills that I had developed in prison and try to apply them. And it became a whole different ballgame, right? A whole different ballgame of practicing what you do in a confined environment and doing it back into reality. So I think there's a lot that the authorities that are in charge of this type of programming can do to start to address the social stigma. There's also structural stigma with regard to the way that interventions can be conducted. So we have to get over stigmatizing approaches that can be unintentionally built into the programming and the interventions that we're applying. And then self-stigma, really, with regard to that, it requires addressing the primary needs that all human beings have. We have a need for attachment, and we have a need for authenticity. And one of the things that is horrible about becoming involved in a violent extremist organization is that you get groupthink or you lose individuation in thought. And so when you're removed from that group, if you don't have another group to belong to, right, then you still, when you're in an in-group, out-group situation, you feel stigmatized and you feel animosity. Now, if you don't any longer have any group to belong to, then you feel stigma from everyone, and it can become overwhelming. So we look at Kruglansky's model, simplified. It's empirical, but it creates a good framework that's based upon something we identified in best practices of recidivism reduction, which is needs narrative network. And in the work of Annie P. Casey Foundation, working with ministries in the United States, they've found that if you can adjust a person's life skills and awarenesses along the lines of the interventions that we're talking about, and then identify the reality that the stories we tell about ourselves that give us meaning in our life have direct correlations to the behaviors we engage in, and understanding the role of the social connection, the social connectivity that Heidi identifies as ultimately important in the social ecological aspect, that network can change. And if you can get someone embedded in a pro-social network and think about where they're going home to and the groups that they're going to be involved in and the identity that they're formulating as a result of altering their narrative, then you can help them provide an environment through which the stigma can be overcome because they have the social support system that they need. But if the environment, if the community is not receptive and is stigmatizing in its own nature, then it doesn't matter the work that you do at the individual, because it's still the social circumstances are not going to be conducive to facilitating the long-term maintenance of any skill set they've learned to adjust themselves.
Sophia, do you want to chime in, or should I go to some more questions? Okay, great. All right, so we've got some really good ones coming in from the audience. I think actually Jesse really tackled a bit of some examples of what resilience might look like, which would be helpful. And that question was from Lisa Church, who's been part of the USIP Vader project. But if Sophia or Heidi, if you have any thoughts on what does resilience look like in the context of rehabilitation and reintegration of those who are formerly associated with violent extremism, be really useful to put those into our conversation as well.
I can speak to that a little bit. So I think Jess already touched upon the issue of resilience with the examples that he used, where even after somebody could have disavowed their previous beliefs or actions that were associated with a radical group or some radical actions, they could be re-traumatized and triggered in a way that would lead them right back into the environment that they know and feel comfortable with. And so one thing that we would want is for an individual to develop a level of resilience to stressors like that, which would be necessarily some sort of an emotional buffer, an emotional resilience, a repertoire of techniques and ideas to protect them from situations and people and ideas that are triggering for them, as well as a toolkit of cognitive ideas and counter arguments that they could use if by chance or by design they run into somebody from that environment who is interested in bringing them back in. So along these two directions, the emotional resilience and cognitive preparedness, there are a number of different assessments that we can use in order to measure whether we're doing a good job effectively boosting those things. Some of them are well established, some can be tried, as Jess said, tinker and try and figure it out. But I think those are the two most fruitful directions that I see: emotional resilience and cognitive kind of buffering of ideas that could be potentially pitfalls for that particular individual, that particular culture.
Yeah, and if I may add briefly there as well, the word resilience appears in all different sectors depending on who you're talking to. In the trauma context, we see it in the context of community preparedness and community resilience that also comes up as far as structural integrity and the ways that entire communities are responding to disaster, to change, etc. And then individual resilience to violent extremism. But I do think, and in the context of reintegration work, we have to make a decision as practitioners in the space. Are we looking at the individual, the resilience of an individual person to violent extremism, or the resilience in the broader sense of their resilience towards falling back into any sort of antisocial behavioral outcome, whether it be violent extremism or drug addiction or domestic partner violence, etc. So by taking a more behavioral health approach, comprehensive approach to understanding resilience, and the way that we've used it in the past is about making someone agentically capable of navigating uncertainty in their system. So it's about increasing agency. Is the person making agentic choices? Because often the journey into radicalization, there are elements of it that are agentic, but at the same time, it's influenced by a host of subconscious processes that a person is only partially aware of, whether it's their past trauma, whether it's discrimination, or whether it's different factors in cognitive processing that make them susceptible to certain messages. Fundamentally, and in the context of trauma healing as well, this is about a restoration of agency. control over brain-body reaction, a sense of bodily autonomy and autonomy over my decisions, feeling a sense of stability, predictability, control, and mastery is fundamental to trauma recovery, but it also should be part and parcel of the process of moving away and disengaging from violent extremism, that I am the captain of my ship, I am the master of my choices. And whether that's in how I react to a trauma reminder or to a traumatic stimulus, or whether it's to a certain form of messaging. So that whether it's this, if I'm stepping back into the same environment that pushed me towards violence, is my response to this environment when I'm put back in it, whether or not the environment has changed, am I going to have a more agentic response that I can be in charge of the direction that I go in, irrespective of those circumstances? So I would define it very simply as a agentic capacity to navigate uncertainty.
Do we have time for more on resilience, or do we need to wrap? Okay, I'll be quick. I want to appreciate both of those comments, and I think part of where you were heading, Mike, is it's important to think of resilience not as a thing that someone has or doesn't have, but as a process that can be nurtured. And part of that is around recognizing strengths, and nobody is uniformly resilient or not resilient. You know, the complexity of humanity is that we're kind of a mess. We're a little bit of everything. And so if we can look at people with that lens and start finding the strengths, and so here's someone who, I'm thinking of a case that was presented recently to me, and the practitioner said, I'm worried this woman is a danger. She's radicalized. So there were some concerns. On the other hand, here was a woman who had had several meetings with practitioners, was willing to talk to them, was very concerned about her kids and their well-being, and had made some choices to make sure her kids were in good spaces. And so there's a tremendous amount of strength. If we miss that and kind of uniformly look at risk or lack of resilience, we've lost the opportunity to build resilience through that sort of transactional process of supporting someone's strengths and recognizing those.
Such an important point, and probably one of my favorite things that I've had the opportunity to do at USIP was talking about how to flip the script from a risk analysis to a strength finder. And it may sound cheeky at certain points, but there is probably nothing more powerful than asking somebody what makes them strong and helping them build that, rather than trying to always diagnose all of the deficiencies and then trying to fix those from the outside. Okay, we have a lot of really good questions here, so I'm going to try and continue to get through them. So the next one from Tammy Palacios is asking if any of the panelists may comment on what practitioners need or could use to help them do this type of work, practitioner self-care, perhaps.
I read that question a bit differently, Leanne, about helping them interact with radicalized individuals. I was reading that more as coming from a potentially vastly different cultural, ideological paradigm. That how do you create any sort of framework or groundwork of authenticity and sharing of legitimate experiences across such a potentially wide gap? I am firmly planted in the Middle Eastern context, so I have interacted almost exclusively with folks that are coming from Islamic jihadist groups. And it's consistently surprising to me how expressing that I am an Arabic-speaking, non-Arab Christian is already sort of makes me enough of an outsider, but also with enough familiarity that I'm kind of just an anomaly to most folks. So I actually have found that just being very upfront and honest about me and my background hasn't caused problems in my interactions with radicalized folks in the past. But as far as the self-care part that you alluded to, Leanne, every person's path is different there, and engaging in these environments managing that successfully looks different for each person. And the fundamental premise there is self-monitoring. My signs and symptoms of these issues affecting me too much are very different from Jesse's, from Heidi's, from Sophia's, I imagine. So everyone setting up a healthy self-monitoring system is critical there.
I like Mike's interpretation of the question as well. So feel free to take either for any of the other panelists. I realize that sometimes in interpreting people's questions from the chat, we don't get that exactly right. A good reminder for us all that there's always room for interpretation. So feel free to take either one of those if anyone else wants to jump in.
I think one of the things that practitioners benefit most from is a nuanced understanding of the culture. I think history is really important. especially when you're talking about jihadists. It's also very important when you talk about certain dimensions of what we consider to be the far right wing extremist threat, where history plays a predominant role. Because what it allows you to do is it allows you to refrain from dehumanizing or out-group classifying the individuals that you're working with, whether that's implicit or explicit. It oftentimes comes across when they send, I get war stories of people that first worked with moderate Sufi imams and were completely infuriated. And then somebody says, well, talk to Jesse because, you know, he's a little bit different. And suddenly that nuanced understanding of the ideology, the culture, because I don't think we should talk about ideology unless we talk about ideology as a component of culture. I really think it's important to embed those two. So if you don't understand the culture and you're a practitioner, a lot of unintentional harms can come about. So I think we look at data on radicalization in general, but we don't give enough power to interventionists that might very well be moderate imams, but they might not understand the epistemological worldview that differentiates a Salafi jihadist from a Salafi or an Ashari from a Salafi. And unfortunately, we kind of demoted the role of ideology once it got pushed back. But if you're going to build rapport and you're going to show empathy, which it requires to develop that rapport, you're going to have to be able to talk in the epistemological language. We work with right-wing extremists and talk with them like they're human beings. And I can't tell you the amount of pushback that we've had to deal with people trying to cancel culture us as a result of doing so. And so that's a big hindrance because in the long run, it just further facilitates the us versus them worldview, further facilitates the belief that there's no alternative but to belong to what I'm involved in. I cannot leave. They will never accept me leaving. They will never talk with me. I'm not that bad. And then you end up conflating Islamists and jihadists in your mentality and you don't even realize it. Or you end up conflating a Trump supporter with a fascist. And nothing could be more counterproductive. We should have learned that from CVE, and we're now doing the same thing as we transition into working on domestic extremism. So that nuanced understanding, that's the sixth component of trauma-informed care, as Samsha outlines it in a document that I think anyone interested in trauma-informed care should read, is ultimately crucial to being able to be a good practitioner.
I'm happy to just jump in and reiterate, I think, a couple points that have already been made. I think self-care, well, so first of all, this is another vote for recognizing strengths, because it's not only critical to how an individual feels perceived and they're in building relationship with a practitioner, but it also is really important for the practitioner. So someone coming into the work thinking, am I safe? Is this person radicalized? Am I holding, public safety in my hands when I do this work? Is this person in danger? It's going to be very hard to develop empathy and a sense of confidence and competence in the work that I am doing. On the other hand, if I can come in and see that person as a human being who, maybe a mother who has really struggled to make choices in a hard situation where there were no right answers and made mistakes along the way, but needs a second chance, that's much easier for me to feel empathy and do that work. So it's really important for both provider and receiver for strengths to be on the table. I think it's also another vote for multidisciplinary teams, because we can't do this work alone. We can't operate in silos and carry the weight of that. We have a mantra in our clinical team, never worry alone. And what we don't want is, someone awake at night in bed thinking, oh my God, did I do the wrong thing? Did I make the wrong call? What am I doing in this situation? We want the person's supervisor to also be awake at night thinking that. We want a whole team to take the pressure off of an individual, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to sustain work that is inherently challenging, frustrating, difficult, risky, but can also be rewarding if we're able to work together and kind of hold that hope and see strengths in the process.
Thank you so much, everyone. So I'll move on to the next question. There's actually two from Mia Bloom. They're separate questions, so I'll put them both on the table. The first one is the case of Sally Eshahini. How do you know that repatriating her children was successful? And I think the question of success is is something that we have touched in different ways, but we have not talked about kind of the repatriation of children specifically. And then her second question is about significant differences, not just because of age, but because of gender, drawing on the French reintegration, which did not differentiate between girls and boys, and recognizing that some of the boys may have participated in different types of violence, while some of the girls may have had early marriage and other types of trauma. So two very different questions, and welcome anybody to jump in on them.
With Sally or El-Hassani's child, some things need to be confined to the private, yes, and only those that need to measure and evaluate them, I think, until we build out an actual system where it would be of benefit to knowing outcomes and best practices with regard to that reintegration. We should get to that point, but we're not there yet. And I think it could be incredibly stigmatizing to release information on that case. But in the other situation with regard to gender dynamics, I'll let other people answer that. But I think it's all about, like you talked, Leanne, about taking an asset-based versus asset-based versus deficit-based is one way it's referred to, right, in the literature. But we need to do biopsychosocial risk assessments in the same manner, because if we can utilize a strength-based approach to develop a rapport and then conduct a risk assessment as a component of a biopsychosocial that feeds into an actual treatment plan, we can not only develop protocols that are just standard practice in mental health, substance abuse counseling, and other arenas, but don't exist yet in our field, but that can look for that information, which can differentiate not only like attachment styles in dealing with children is very important to identify, motivational styles, things of this nature, but the experiences that feed off and into those, the diversification in each case is individual. But it is simply the case that a lot of things that have happened that could have been traumatizing, that need to be healed, or that create opportunities for discussions that can be effective in addressing the underlying risk factors that could be associated with a re-radicalization, are oftentimes missed because we don't have an ability to conduct biopsychosocials after we conduct risk assessments. In FTF and family member reintegration, typically we have a risk assessment. It's the first thing that happens when they get off the plane. We don't have a development of rapport and then do a biopsychosocial, which can allow us to establish rapport and then do a risk assessment. So it's ass backwards, so to say. I'll stop there.
Heidi or Sophia, anything else to add?
I'm good.
Nothing too insightful to add, but Mia, I wanted to respond to your question about gender and gender differences in trauma experiences, and that's true not just of these kids. That's true in a lot of contexts. So a good trauma clinician will be thinking about not just trauma as a uniform experience, but kind of the ways in which that trauma ripples into an individual's relationships and experiences of themselves and their relation to those around them. So critical that we understand what kinds of experiences someone has been through. We may not be able to start there because there's a lot of safety and security building that needs to happen first. But yes, that's taking into account not just how the trauma itself is different, but how that's going to ripple out into different assumptions about the world and the people around you and yourself, and shape your relationships is going to be really critical.
Yeah, it's an incredibly important point, and I think Mike's technical difficulties got the best of him, but I know he has often schooled me on the various ways in which trauma manifests. Has a lot to do with the person, not just the event itself. So the same exact traumatic event experienced by different people, whether that's at different age levels, at different genders, at different points in their life, based on different types of trauma that may have preceded that, the like, can manifest in a variety of different ways. And so as outsiders, particularly on the policy side, we often think that it is the precipitating event that is going to have the ultimate impact as to the behavioral outcome. The more we work with psychologists and those in behavioral and mental health, the more that we get to appreciate that it's not just the precipitating event, it is often how it manifests within the individual. And that's something that we have to continue to dig even deeper on the gendered aspect as well. Okay, so we've had several comments from Ayub Adam, who's really been trying to help us think about trauma in the space of active conflicts. So he's had some points about stopping conflict as being part of this, on how to get to reconciliation. And then he recently put a pretty long comment, if the panelists can kind of scroll through it, about how trauma and emotions and negative emotions are connected, but also looking at the positive on positive emotions. And so I might take a little bit of moderator's liberty by asking, when there's active conflict or has been pervasive conflict over time, how that really impacts how we think about repatriation. Tends to be the challenge where people have left the conflict. I spent a lot of time writing last summer about what about in the situations where the conflict is home and the participation is resident in conflict spaces. How do we think about that?
I want to hog the floor, but I do have some thoughts, if that's okay. So in the treatment model that we work with, trauma treatment is phase-based. And the reason for that is we need to be thinking not just about the degree to which trauma is affecting someone's ability to regulate emotions, but we also need to think about the degree to which the social environment that they're living in is stable or distressed or even threatening. And in the context of a threatening social environment, you can't start processing a trauma because there's no way to put a traumatic experience into context and in the past if it's happening. And all attention needs to really go towards stabilizing that social environment and thinking about what do we need to do to the degree that we can create safety for this individual. Obviously, a conflict zone, there's not a whole lot of control that we have. But we need to be thinking about, what is the family context, and if there's domestic violence that's ongoing, you don't take the child and talk to them about how they feel about domestic violence. You focus on changing the violence that's happening around them. So I think we need to be mindful of kind of phases of treatment. And one of the things that I think can happen that's a little concerning is when trauma is highlighted as a critical aspect of treatment, and then providers who maybe don't have as much training in that as we would like are asked to do the work. They jump to, oh, trauma is the problem, I should do trauma processing. And that's actually not always indicated. And we need to instead be thinking about what's the skill building that needs to happen first so that someone can do the trauma processing. What's the stabilization of the social environment that needs to happen so that someone is secure enough and safe enough that they can begin that very difficult work of trauma processing. So I would suggest that this is a really important comment, and that the work we're doing needs to be trauma informed, not trauma processing. And in our thinking about trauma informed work is considering the safety and stability of the social environment.
So I don't see anyone else chiming in, but I might ask from both Jesse and Sophia. So some of the work that you all talked about in your responses, do you think that it could be applied within these unstable situations? I'm particularly thinking of the MBSR stuff that you all talked about, or do we really, should we be taking a very different approach in conflict affected spaces?
I see MBSR as a very useful tool for a variety of situations where more traditional approaches would not work, actually, because it skirts the necessity to self-disclose and to address trauma directly, and instead it invites people to build the strength, as many people emphasize. This is really important. Build the strengths to sustain stressful situations and to not react to them in ways that are self-destructing or that are harmful in other ways. And it invites people to connect with their own humanity and with that of others, which is, I think, probably the best way to connect in situations where there's a lot of strong emotions and violence and just very triggering situations. So yeah, I think there is a huge potential for implementing this in these scenarios.
Yeah, in conflict settings, it's really all about controlling the space between stimulus and response, because the conditions of uncertainty are so exorbitant, impossible when you think about how to achieve, a trauma conscious conflict setting alteration. Very, very, very difficult to think about, but I think we'll learn more about that as we finally get to the realm of conflict prevention as opposed to counterterrorism with Global Fragility Act. So what you're mentioning is important, but I don't think we know how to achieve that yet. It would be wonderful to get to that area, though.
I actually think that's the right answer, is that there's a lot of things that are quite unknown. We have recently started to build up more of our reconciliation practice at the Institute, and all of the ways in which ritual and cultural narratives and the like can be stabilizing within very unstable situations have, in my experience, have not been brought to bear on people exiting violent groups, especially for those who defect or are disillusioned or leave on their own, in addition to they may have made their own cognitive, behavioral, and group breaks, but that doesn't mean that they're the communities in which the group they were a part of who have experienced that direct harm. So a lot of the stigma we were talking about was indirect harm, that is the narrative harm of being a family of ISIS member. But for the communities who were impacted by the direct harm, I think that the components of both transitional justice, of reckoning, of absolution, I mean, there are plenty of both criminal and non-criminal ways in which to build those accountability mechanisms, which I think will also have to be part and parcel in the conflict settings that we're talking about. Okay, we have one more question from Tammy, who this is not about violent extremism, but for those who are working on integration of Afghan refugees, if you guys have any advice for those who are dealing with general change, possible trauma, and any advice for those who are working on integration. I kind of look at you, Heidi, first, but anyone, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that, but why don't I drop a link in the chat to a online toolkit that might be helpful, and I'm also happy to talk offline about other resources and supports.
Thank you. Yeah, that sounds great. Fantastic. Okay, I think we have hit most of the audience-driven questions, and we're also kind of in the last 7 minutes of our webinar today. So if there are any additional audience questions, feel free to drop those in and we'll maybe try and get to them. In the meantime, if there are any other concluding remarks or concluding thoughts that panelists have, I'd be happy to spend our remaining time kind of talking through those. So maybe we could go in reverse order from the way in which we spoke, which I'd be putting Sophia on the spot first, if there's any kind of concluding remarks or thoughts that you'd like to share.
I'm excited to be joining this very experienced group and bringing in my different perspective from the point of view of an academic who studied radicalization and de-radicalization, and also a clinical practitioner. I feel that there is a lot of potential to boost the effectiveness of the programs that are targeting these vulnerable populations. And now with 20 years of research behind us, we can do so much better than what we were capable of doing when we first really approached this problem. So I think a lot of good things are going to happen.
And I'm excited to have Sophia join our group. And a lot of us on this call will actually be working together in different capacities on a couple separate projects. And I'm sure Leanne will be kept in touch with as we try to learn more. One of the interesting things for me has been like just throwing yourself out there and working with the population, and then meeting great people like Heidi and referencing their research and the great work that USIP is doing, and then getting Sophia involved to press it even further forward has been like really rewarding for me, because you learn so much as somebody who just applies life experience, has a little bit of an academic understanding, and then you get like to have your ideas adjusted. And I think that that is why it's really important to think in terms of systems and in terms of networks and in terms of creating communities of practice, and having 3-part webinars like this to update communities on progress and to make these accessible to those that are dealing with these questions, because there's an enormous amount of questions that go forth to any government that considers repatriation, rehabilitation, and reintegration. And it's so complex. And if one case goes wrong, it's as if the entire effort has failed, which should not be the case, but in fact it is. And the cost to clean up from one case of recidivism back into terrorism is more exorbitant than the cost that it would cost to prevent that case. So we really do need to develop better evidence-based practices in the arena of interventions, get a little bit further away from the think tank reports and the publishing of broad, overgeneralized, non-empirical recommendations, usually written by people that have never actually met an extremist in their life. I'll end with that.
Thank you so much, everyone, for this conversation. And I think one of the fun things for me in these conversations is they are, in fact, multidisciplinary. Just as we're saying, multidisciplinary teams are a great way to go in terms of working with families. I think it's also a really important way to hold these conversations, because there's so much depth and richness to these conversations, because we do come with different expertise and backgrounds. And so I just wanted to appreciate everyone for sharing from their perspective and from their experience. And to also say I'm excited to be able to integrate maybe practitioners who are doing the work in different settings. Like you said, Jesse, sometimes those of us who do the most talking have had the least actual experience. So making sure that we're balancing the conversation and the different types of knowledge that are out there as we try to together figure out this important and kind of unknown challenge.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. It's been my pleasure to moderate all 3 of these, hosted by the Alliance for Peace Building, which continues to be just such a champion for the place of peace building in national security, in foreign policy, in development policy. I mean, elevating the role of peace building is something that I have the pleasure of doing at the Institute of Peace, but it's really wonderful to be a part of the consortium of the Alliance for Peace Building. So big thanks to Megan and Liz Hume, who couldn't be with us, for your constant championship of the value of peace in these really complex challenges that have to do with security and violence. It's been such an honor to be able to be sharing the Zoom screen with our distinguished panel. I learned so much from all of you, and will continue to assimilate as much as possible into our ongoing practice led by my incredible colleague, Chris Bosley. If you don't know him, you should. And the incredible work that is going to be forthcoming from the Institute, led by Lisa Church, who was one of the people who was asking some of the questions. And we hope to be continuing to contribute to this community of practice on ways in which frontline peace builders, frontline practitioners can be doing more work in more places to help on disengagement and on reconciliation. So thank you again to everybody for your time this morning, and it's been my pleasure to be a host of this. So AFP, if there's anything else that needs to be said, please feel free. Otherwise, I'm happy to end this conversation.
No, just a big thank you to you, Leanne, for moderating such a rich discussion, and all of our panelists. This has been a really informational, informative, illuminating series that we put together here. So appreciate your partnership. Leanne and Jesse in particular have helped sort of steer these conversations. So big thanks again, and look forward to getting together again soon. So thank you.